Today, we're digging into one of history's most magnetic, most controversial figures, Lord Byron. And this guy, he wasn't just a poet. He was a full-blown phenomenon. And his story, it ends with a huge mystery and a bonfire. You've probably heard this quote. It's from one of his former lovers, Lady Caroline Lamb, and wow, did it stick. For over 200 years, that one line has pretty much perfectly captured the whole legend he so carefully built around himself. And that's really what we're going to do here. Try to get past that myth to find the real person. How did he become the 19th century's biggest, cultural icon? And more importantly, what happens when your real life becomes way too dangerous, even for your own legend? So where does a persona like that even come from? Well, to understand the rebel, you've got to look at the chaos he was born into. And trust me, his family history reads like something straight out of a Gothic novel. Just look at this. You can see there's a real pattern of instability here. His grandfather, a naval admiral they called Foul-Weather Jack, because, storms literally seemed to follow his ships. And his dad, Mad Jack, absolutely lived up to the name. He married Byron's mom for her money, blew through her entire fortune, we're talking everything, in just 2 years, and then skipped town to France to dodge his debts. And as if that chaotic family life wasn't enough, Byron was born with a clubfoot. Now, you have to remember this was the time when aristocratic men were supposed to be physically perfect. So for him, this disability became a huge source of shame, and it fueled this lifelong complex. He was just relentlessly driven to prove he wasn't weak. So this constant, relentless drive to overcome his insecurities, it didn't just shape his private life. It became the engine for his public persona, and ultimately, his insane rise to fame. He basically turned his inner demons into a public spectacle. To prove he was strong, he went and swam the Hellespont, a super treacherous strait from Greek mythology. And to show his total contempt for authority, when Cambridge University had a no-dogs rule, he found a loophole and brought a pet bear to live with him in his dorm room. A bear! Then, in 1812, he's just 24 years old, and he publishes the first part of a long poem called Childe Harold's Pilgrimage. The reaction was absolutely electric. As he put it himself, he literally became a star overnight. But the public frenzy was so nuts, it actually needed its own name. They called it Byromania. Seriously, think of it like the 19th century version of Beatlemania. Women would literally fight to get near him at parties. But people weren't just obsessed with his good looks. They were obsessed with his character he had created, both on the page and, in his own life. He basically invented a whole new kind of hero, the Byronic hero. This was not your clean-cut do-gooder champion. Oh no. This was a character who was arrogant, moody, passionate, and haunted by some secret sin from his past. He hated society's rules, and that's exactly what made him so dangerously attractive. He was like the perfect mix of romantic passion and Milton's charismatic Satan from Paradise Lost. And the influence of this archetype is just staggering. Without the Byronic hero, we probably don't get Heathcliff from Wuthering Heights or Mr. Rochester from Jane Eyre. And get this, Byron's own personal doctor, a guy named John Polidori, wrote the very first modern vampire story, The Vampire, and he based its aristocratic, seductive villain directly on his famous patient. But okay, if we start to peel back the layers of this dark, brooding myth, what we find is a far more complex and, contradictory artist. That whole bad boy thing was really only part of the story. I mean, just look at the incredible range in his poetry. On the one hand, you've got She Walks in Beauty, which is this breathtakingly pure and beautiful poem about innocence. And then on the other hand, you have Darkness, a totally bleak, terrifying vision of the end of the world where the sun burns out and the last people on Earth turn on each other. It's kind of hard to believe they came from the same mind. And here's another surprise for you. The man who was famous for all his public excesses and affairs, he also had this deeply intellectual, scholarly side that he mostly kept under wraps. For example, while he was living in Venice in 1816, this supposed playboy actually spent a ton of time in an Armenian monastery. And he wasn't there to party. He was there to study. He was seriously learning the language and even helped the monks write an English-Armenian grammar book. But let's be clear, just because he had this hidden scholarly side, it doesn't mean his private life wasn't every bit as radical and norm-defying as his public reputation made it out to be. The scandals followed him everywhere. The rumors of an incestuous affair with his half-sister Augusta Lee became so toxic that he was basically forced to leave England forever in 1816. On top of that, historical letters and journals confirm he had relationships with men, which, flew directly in the face of the rigid moral and legal codes of his time. So, in the last chapter of his life, he tried to become a real-life hero, joining the Greek War of Independence. But the romantic myth of the poet warrior was about to collide with a very, very grim reality. And he wasn't just over there writing inspiring poems. Byron was a hands-on commander and diplomat. He poured his own personal fortune into the cause, spending a massive £4,000, which was a fortune back then, to single-handedly fund the rebuilding of the Greek navy. After all that, you'd probably expect him to die a hero's death on the battlefield, right? But Byron's end was, well, anything but glorious. It was tragic, it was painful, and honestly, pretty ironic. He came down with a really bad fever in the swampy town called Missolonghi, probably a recurrence of malaria. But his doctors, instead of helping him, pretty much sealed his fate. They were obsessed with bloodletting, so they just kept bleeding him with leeches and scalpels, weakening his already frail body until he finally died. And his death brings us right back to the central mystery of his life, and the reason so much of his true story is still a question mark. We have to talk about the fate of his unvarnished, brutally honest memoir. See, the real controversy here is what was actually in that memoir. We don't really know because the handful of people who read it gave wildly different accounts. One critic called it a book fit for a brothel, while a society lady said it was so harmless she'd let her teenage daughter read it. So, which was it? Right after the news of Byron's death got back to London, his closest friends and his publisher all got together in a room. And in what is now this infamous act of literary censorship, they took his massive 120,000-word manuscript, his entire life story in his own words, and page by page they tore it up and threw it in a fireplace. So why would they do that? Simple. It was the ultimate act of reputation management. They were afraid that the messy, human, and scandalous reality of the man would tarnish the immortal myth they wanted to preserve. So they destroyed the man to save the brand. And that act created the divided legacy we see today. In his home country of England, he was seen as so corrupt that he was denied a burial spot in Westminster Abbey for almost 150 years. But in Greece, he's revered as a national hero, with streets named in his honor all over the country. Which leaves us with one last big question. When his friends lit that fire, what were they really burning? Were they just protecting his legacy by destroying his sins? Or did they destroy something way more valuable? The complex, contradictory, and all too human truth of the man behind the myth. What was truly lost in those flames?